My brother walked away after seeing me collapse in a freezing snowstorm. The next morning, he showed up at the hospital and casually asked the doctor how I was doing. The doctor looked at him and delivered one single sentence. My brother froze his face, turning pale as police officers stepped out from the hallway. I am Paige, 33 years old, and until that freezing night in Aspen, I actually believed family meant something. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you. Sign the paper, Paige. Trent shoved the thick legal deed directly into my chest. The heavy parchment crumpled against my sweater, but I refused to take it from his hands. We were standing in the living room of our late grandmother's cabin in Aspen, Colorado. Outside, a massive blizzard was tearing through the mountains, throwing sheets of white against the large glass windows, but the temperature inside the cabin felt just as hostile. Trent was 36 years old, a vice president at a prominent investment fund, and the undisputed golden child of our family. He wore his expensive cashmere sweater and custom watch like armor, but right now, that armor was cracking. He needed me to sign over my half of the cabin, a property worth over $2 million. He claimed he was facing a temporary liquidity issue and just needed collateral for a short-term bridge loan. But I am a director of healthcare data analytics. My entire career is built on finding anomalies in complex systems, verifying records, and identifying fraud. I knew how to spot bad numbers. I knew my brother was drowning in massive debt. His wife Jada, a lifestyle influencer who built her massive online following by pretending they lived like royalty, was currently back in Seattle swiping credit cards that were undoubtedly on the verge of bouncing. I am not signing away grandmother's house to fund Jada's designer bag collection, I told him, letting the deed fall to the rustic wooden floor between us. I stood my ground, keeping my voice steady. You have been living beyond your means for 5 years, Trent. You cannot use my inheritance to bail yourself out of a margin call. Trent's face contorted with a mixture of panic and rage. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. You do not understand how much trouble I am in, he hissed, his polished facade entirely gone. I need this capital by Monday morning. If I do not secure this loan, my firm is going to start looking into my accounts. They will see everything. Then you should have thought about that before you started treating client money like your personal piggy bank, I replied evenly, yanking my arm free from his grip. I am not liquidating a family asset because you and Jada cannot stick to a budget. Tell your wife she needs to fly commercial for once. The mention of Jada made Trent snap completely. He lunged forward, grabbing the deed from the floor and forcing me backward toward the heavy wooden front door of the cabin. You have always been a selfish, jealous brat, he yelled, his face inches from mine. You sit in your boring corporate job and judge us because you do not know what it takes to maintain a real image. He grabbed the brass handle of the front door and yanked it open. The sub-zero wind and driving snow immediately howled into the cozy cabin, knocking over a lamp and sending a flurry of paperwork flying across the room. Before I could brace myself, Trent shoved me hard. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the icy planks of the front porch. I fell hard against the wooden railing, the sudden blast of -10-degree air hitting my unprotected face. I have had severe asthma since I was a young child. Extreme cold is my absolute worst trigger. Combined with the massive spike of adrenaline from the physical altercation, my lungs reacted instantly. It felt as though a heavy iron band had clamped down around my chest. My airway began seizing shut violently and rapidly. I dropped to my knees on the snow-covered porch, gasping desperately for air that simply would not enter my lungs. A terrible wheezing sound escaped my throat. I clutched at my chest, my vision already beginning to blur at the edges. I needed my emergency rescue inhaler. It was in the pocket of my heavy winter coat, which was currently hanging on the rack just inside the warm, brightly lit cabin. I reached out a shaking hand toward the open doorway. Trent? I gasped the word, barely a rasp. Inhaler. Please. Trent stood in the doorway, perfectly safe and warm. He looked down at me, struggling to draw a single life-saving breath. Then he looked at the unsigned legal deed still clutched in his hand. His expression shifted from blind anger to something incredibly cold, calculating, and terrifyingly calm. "If you are not going to help me, Paige, you are just a liability," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He did not turn around to grab my coat. He did not pull out his expensive smartphone to call emergency services. Instead, he stepped out onto the freezing porch, crouched beside my convulsing body, and reached his hand into the front pocket of my jeans. He pulled out the keys to my four-wheel drive vehicle. Then, without a single second glance, my brother stood up, stepped right over my gasping body, and walked down the snow-covered driveway. I watched through dimming, tear-filled eyes as he climbed into his luxury SUV, started the engine, and drove away into the absolute whiteout conditions, leaving me alone to freeze to death in the snow. The red glow of Trent's taillights bled into the swirling white curtain of the blizzard, fading until there was absolutely nothing left but the blinding snow and the deafening howl of the wind. I lay there on the icy wooden planks of the porch with my chest heaving in shallow, useless spasms. The cold was not just a temperature, but a physical entity, a predator sinking its teeth into my exposed skin. Every desperate attempt to inhale felt like drawing shattered glass directly down my trachea. He was truly gone. My own brother had looked me in the eyes, calculated the value of my life against his margin calls, and chosen his bank account without a second of hesitation. Panic is an absolute death sentence for an asthmatic. My analytical brain, the same brain that commanded a high-level executive salary dissecting complex healthcare data models, forcibly shoved the terror aside. I had to evaluate the variables of my survival immediately. Variable A was the temperature currently plummeting past -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Variable B was my airway closing tighter with every passing second as the freezing air shocked my bronchial tubes. Variable C was the distance to the main access road, approximately 200 yards, down a steeply winding and unplowed driveway. The cabin itself was miles from the main highway. The odds of my survival were statistically abysmal. But I absolutely refused to become a convenient tragedy for Trent and Jada to exploit for sympathy and financial gain. I tried to stand by, grabbing the frozen wooden railing for support, but my legs buckled instantly. The lack of oxygen was already starving my muscles of their basic function. Walking was a physical impossibility. If I stayed on that porch, I would freeze to death within the hour and become nothing more than a frozen stepping stone to Trent's financial freedom. I had to move right now. I dragged my body off the edge of the porch, dropping heavily into the knee-deep powder of the driveway. The shock of the snow soaking through my thin cashmere sweater was instantaneous and brutal. The moisture seeped into my jeans, turning the fabric into a freezing, heavy restraint that clung to my skin. I began to crawl. I dug my bare, trembling hands into the icy powder and pulled my dead weight forward inch by agonizing inch. The wind roared through the towering aspen pines around me, mocking my pathetic progress. My hands quickly lost all sensation as the fingers turned a raw, angry red before shifting to a terrifying, bloodless white. Drag, pull, gasp. The cycle became my entire universe. Ice crystals lashed against my face like tiny razors, slicing my cheeks and freezing my eyelashes together. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint, dark tree line that marked the edge of the property. I needed to reach the county road. It was the only route that might possibly see a plow or a salt truck before morning. The physical agony in my chest was absolute torture. My lungs were screaming as they desperately demanded air that the constricted airways simply refused to deliver. A high-pitched, rattling wheeze forced its way out of my throat with every single exhalation, creating a pathetic soundtrack to my desperate fight for life. To distract myself from the overwhelming sensation of suffocation, I focused intensely on the anger. I pictured Jada sitting in her pristine Seattle penthouse, recording a lifestyle vlog with a counterfeit smile while waiting for the phone call, confirming her sister-in-law had tragically succumbed to the elements. I pictured Trent standing at my funeral, wearing a bespoke black suit paid for with my inheritance, dabbing away fake tears while secretly calculating exactly how quickly he could liquidate my healthcare analytics firm. That vivid image of their absolute unpunished triumph was a hotter fire than the freezing snow could ever extinguish. Anger was a remarkably effective fuel when oxygen was lacking. 10 yards. 20 yards. My knees struck the hidden gravel beneath the snow, tearing the fabric of my jeans and scraping my skin completely raw. I did not care about the bleeding. I pushed forward and dragged my frozen limbs through the rapidly mounting drifts. The blizzard was escalating fiercely rapidly, burying the deep tracks Trent's luxury SUV had just made. The absolute isolation of the Colorado mountains pressed down on me from all sides. I was entirely alone out there, just a speck of failing biology in a vast and completely uncaring winter storm. 50 yards. 100 yards. My vision began to narrow severely, the edges of the world turning dark and fuzzy. Hypoxia was setting in. My brain was actively starving for oxygen, shutting down non-essential functions to keep my heart beating. The terrifying symptoms of severe hypothermia followed closely behind the hypoxia. The agonizing, biting cold suddenly began to recede, replaced by a bizarre and highly dangerous sensation of warmth. My mind whispered deceptively that it would be so much easier to just stop moving. Just close my eyes for a single minute. Just let the soft snow act as a comforting blanket. The urge to surrender was a heavy, intoxicating gravity pulling me down into the powder. No. I bit my own lip hard enough to taste copper, using the sharp, sudden spike of pain to jolt my fading consciousness back to reality. I shoved the lethal comfort aside and forced my bleeding hands to dig into the ice once more. Drag. Pull. Gasp. I could not let them win this. I could not let my death be the convenient solution to his massive corporate fraud. I visualized the data architecture in my mind. I visualized the bank routing numbers, the offshore accounts, the digital footprint I knew he must have left behind in his desperation. If I died in the snow, the data died with me. I had to survive long enough to expose him to the world. I finally reached the end of the driveway and collapsed heavily onto the shoulder of the county road. The asphalt was completely buried under more than a foot of fresh snow. There were absolutely no tire tracks. There were no streetlights. There was just an endless tunnel of swirling white surrounding me. I lay on my side with my cheek pressed directly against the ice, my chest barely moving. The violent wheezing had stopped entirely, not because I was breathing any easier, but because there was simply not enough air moving through my failing lungs to make a sound anymore. I had lost the battle. My body had absolutely nothing left to give to the fight. The darkness crept further inward, swallowing the outlines of the trees, swallowing the falling snow, until there was only a tiny pinprick of consciousness remaining. I closed my eyes as the freezing cold finally breached my core and began to shut down my organs. Just as the final thread of awareness began to snap, a deep, rhythmic vibration shuddered through the frozen asphalt directly beneath my cheek. It was not the wind. A low mechanical roar cut through the howling storm, growing louder and heavier with each passing second. I forced my heavy ice-crusted eyelids open one last time. Piercing through the blinding whiteout, massive rotating yellow and halogen white lights erupted into the darkness. The towering steel blade of a heavy county snowplow materialized from the storm and bore down on the road. The blinding lights flooded my entire vision, washing out the snow, washing out the night right as my world went entirely black. The first sensation was not pain, but an overwhelming artificial warmth. The steady rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor anchored me back to reality, pulling my consciousness up from the dark void. I forced my heavy eyelids open against the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent hospital lights. My throat felt as though it had been scoured with crushed glass and wire wool. A thick plastic oxygen mask covered my nose and mouth, pushing forced air into my violently aching lungs. I tried to swallow and instantly choked, a sharp spasm of agony ripping through my damaged vocal cords. I was not in a small mountain clinic. The sophisticated hum of the machinery and the pristine high-tech monitors surrounding my bed told me I was in a major trauma center. Through the large glass window of the intensive care unit, I could see the distinct rain-slicked skyline of Seattle. The medical transport team must have airlifted me back to my home network once I was stabilized in Colorado. My corporate insurance mandated transfers to specialized regional trauma centers, a policy I had personally drafted the data models for just last year. My professional life had unknowingly secured my physical survival. The heavy glass door slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. A woman in crisp navy scrubs and a pristine white coat strode into the room. Her security badge read, Dr. Eris Thorne, Chief of Trauma. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately locked onto mine, assessing my neurological state in a fraction of a second. She did not offer me a pitying smile, nor did she speak to me with the patronizing tone people often reserve for victims. She operated with the exact kind of high-level clinical efficiency I respected in the corporate boardroom. "You are awake," Dr. Thorne stated, moving straight to the monitor beside my bed to check my vitals. "You have been unconscious for 36 hours. A county snowplow driver spotted your hand sticking out of a snowdrift just before his heavy steel blade hit you. You were flown out of Aspen to our trauma unit here in Seattle due to severe hypothermia, acute respiratory failure, and early-stage frostbite. You are incredibly lucky to have all your limbs. You are statistically miraculous to have a pulse." I attempted to speak, desperate to thank her, and immediately ask for the police. The only sound that escaped my mouth was a wet, horrifying rasp that sent a fresh wave of fire down my trachea. "Do not try to use your vocal cords," Dr. Thorne commanded, instantly holding up a steady hand. "Your airway was severely compromised by the freezing air and the subsequent emergency intubation on the flight. You will cause permanent tissue damage if you force it. If you are cognitively aware and need to communicate right now, I can provide a digital tablet." I gave a single stiff nod. My physical body was battered, bruised, and broken, but my analytical mind was operating with absolute ice-cold clarity. The burning anger that had kept me crawling through the blinding snowstorm was now a focused, lethal determination. I needed to move fast before Trent and Jada could control the narrative and twist my near-death experience into a tragic accident. As Dr. Thorne handed me a sterile clinical tablet and a stylus, a broad-shouldered man in a rumpled gray suit stepped into the room. He flashed a silver badge. "I am Detective Russo," he said, his voice gravelly and serious. "I was assigned to your case the moment the Aspen authorities transferred jurisdiction. They found your purse and your luggage locked inside the cabin, but your vehicle and your brother were missing. We have been trying to piece together exactly how a woman with severe asthma ended up freezing in a snowbank while her brother vanished into thin air. If you are able to write, I need to know exactly what happened out there on that porch." I gripped the stylus tightly. My fingers were heavily bandaged, swollen, and trembling from nerve damage, but my muscle memory took over. I did not write a tearful, emotional diary entry. I wrote a highly structured, irrefutable incident report. My entire career as a healthcare data analytics director had trained me to present undeniable data that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. I tapped the stylus against the glass screen, ignoring the sharp shooting pain in my knuckles. I typed my statement in clear clinical bullet points. I detailed Trent demanding I sign over our grandmother's deed to cover his massive financial debt. I detailed the physical altercation. I detailed my severe asthma attack triggered by the cold. Most importantly, I detailed his deliberate theft of my car keys and his conscious, calculated decision to abandon me on that porch to die. Then I handed them the ultimate piece of leverage. I typed out a specific IP address and the highly encrypted login credentials for a private cloud server. I turned the tablet around so both Detective Russo and Dr. Thorne could read the glowing screen. Detective Russo read the text aloud, his eyebrows rising toward his hairline. "You have hidden security cameras at the Aspen cabin." I nodded emphatically, snatching the tablet back to type one final paragraph. "I installed a 4K motion-activated security network along the entire perimeter of the roof and the front porch last summer so I could monitor the vacant property from Seattle. The system uploads raw audio and high-definition video directly to a secure cloud server. Pull the footage from Thursday night between 8 and 9 o'clock. You will not just see him push me into the blizzard. You will see him step right over my dying body to search my pockets for my keys. Detective Russo's posture shifted instantly from a casual investigator to a predator catching a fresh scent of blood. He pulled out his radio and started barking sharp orders to his tech division to access the IP address immediately and secure the video files. Dr. Thorne read the tablet again, her jaw tightening with undisguised disgust. She looked down at me with a newfound level of deep professional respect. "You are a very smart woman, Paige," she said softly. Before anyone else could speak, the ICU room door swung open abruptly. A young triage nurse rushed in looking incredibly stressed, her eyes wide with alarm. "Dr. Thorne," she said breathlessly, clutching a clipboard to her chest. "I am so sorry to interrupt the police interview, but there is a massive situation rapidly escalating down in the main lobby." "What kind of situation?" Dr. Thorne asked, her clinical commanding tone returning instantly. The nurse glanced at me with deep, uncomfortable sympathy. "It is your brother Paige. He just showed up with his wife and a camera crew. He is putting on a massive scene, completely distraught, crying hysterically in front of the reception desk. He is screaming that he has been searching for you in the blizzard for 2 days and is demanding that hospital security let him up to this floor immediately to see his beloved sister." The absolute audacity of my brother was almost impressive in its sickness. He had not just come to check if I was dead, he had brought an audience to document his fake grief for Jada's social media channels. Detective Russo's radio crackled with chatter from the ground floor security detail confirming the chaotic scene unfolding below. I looked at the detective and tapped my stylus fiercely against the digital tablet. My swollen fingers flew across the glass screen, fueled by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I turned the tablet around so both of them could read my hasty typing. "Do not let him up here. He wants a photo opportunity next to an intensive care bed to prove his innocence to his investors and her followers. Confront him in the main lobby where his cameras are rolling. Give him exactly the audience he asked for." Dr. Thorne nodded, her expression hardening into absolute steel. She understood the assignment perfectly. "I will handle the medical update," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. "Detective, you handle the legal update. Let us go give Mr. Gallagher his diagnosis." Before stepping out, Detective Russo handed his department-issued tablet to the triage nurse, instructing her to patch into the hospital's ground floor security feed. I wanted to watch every single second of the confrontation live from my bed. As Thorne and Russo marched out of the room, the nurse propped the heavy tablet on my rolling tray table. The high-definition feed showed the expansive, brightly lit main lobby of the trauma center. Trent was pacing frantically near the reception desk. He was dressed in a carefully disheveled designer sweater, repeatedly running his hands through his perfectly tousled hair to simulate deep emotional distress. Jada stood right beside him, holding her smartphone on a stabilizing gimbal to capture his best angles. She was dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, fully playing the role of the devastated sister-in-law for her 500,000 followers. A small local news crew, undoubtedly tipped off by Jada herself to maximize the exposure, had set up a heavy broadcast camera near the sliding glass exit doors. Even without the audio, his theatrical gestures were sickening to witness. Then the hospital IT team linked the audio feed, and the loud, echoing noise of the lobby filled my quiet room. "You have to let me up there right now!" Trent shouted at the terrified receptionist, making sure his voice carried clearly to the news crew behind him. "That is my little sister. I have been scouring the mountains for 2 days in a massive blizzard looking for her. The police in Aspen did absolutely nothing, so I hired my own search teams. You cannot keep me from her. I need to know if she is going to survive." "Please!" Jada cried out, turning her face directly toward her smartphone camera to ensure her followers caught her distress. "My husband has not slept or eaten in 2 days. We are absolutely beside ourselves with worry. Paige is vulnerable and we just want to bring her safely home." The main elevator doors slid open behind them. Dr. Eris Thorne strode into the lobby, her pristine white coat billowing slightly behind her. Detective Russo walked a half-step back, his hand casually resting near his utility belt. The crowd of patients and visitors parted instinctively for the chief of trauma. "Mr. Gallagher." Dr. Thorne called out, her voice cutting through the lobby noise like a surgical scalpel. Trent spun around. He immediately registered her authoritative security badge and lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the reception counter as if he could barely hold his own weight up. "Doctor, please." Trent begged, his voice cracking with a perfectly practiced, agonizing sob. "How is my sister? I have been looking for her all night. Is she going to make it? Just tell me she is alive." Dr. Thorne did not offer a comforting smile. She did not lower her voice to preserve his privacy. She stood her ground, looked him dead in the eye, and delivered the crushing payload with absolute terrifying clinical precision. "Oh, she is alive, Mr. Gallagher. In fact, she is doing remarkably well. She is alert enough to be watching the 4K security footage with Detective Russo right now." Trent's fake sob stopped instantly. His jaw went slack. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Jada lowered her smartphone gimbal slowly, her manufactured tears vanishing as sheer, unadulterated confusion crossed her features. They were particularly impressed by the high-definition audio. Dr. Thorne continued, her voice echoing loudly through the suddenly silent lobby. "But the detective's favorite part was the moment you stepped right over her convulsing, gasping body to unbuckle the Rolex from her wrist before leaving her to freeze to death." The silence in the lobby was deafening. The local news camera was rolling, capturing every microscopic twitch of terror on Trent's face. Jada took a slow, horrified step away from her husband, realizing her live-streamed performance had just broadcast his guilt directly to the internet. Trent stammered, taking a desperate, stumbling step backward. "That is a lie. She is hallucinating from the cold. I never touched her." Detective Russo stepped around Dr. Thorne, his expression completely devoid of mercy. "Save the performance for the federal judge, Trent. We already have the raw video files uploaded from the cloud server. You are on camera stealing her vehicle keys and driving away while she begged for her inhaler." Fight or flight took over completely. Trent spun around, abandoning his devastated brother act in a split second, and bolted toward the sliding glass exit doors. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 uniformed police officers stepped out from the adjacent corridor, blocking his path entirely. They grabbed his shoulders, slammed him hard against the front reception desk, and pulled his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly across the lobby. "Trent Gallagher!" the taller officer barked, pressing his weight against my brother's struggling frame. "You are under arrest for attempted manslaughter, grand theft auto, and reckless endangerment." Trent thrashed against the cold laminate counter, his face contorted in panic, while Jada stood frozen in horror as her carefully curated world shattered on live video. Watching from my hospital bed, I leaned back against the pillows and took a deep, steadying breath of oxygen. He was finally in chains, but my war against this toxic family was just beginning. The live feed on the tablet abruptly cut out as the triage nurse gently pulled the device away from my tray table. The sterile quiet of the intensive care unit returned, leaving only the rhythmic hissing of my oxygen mask and the steady beep of the heart monitor. I closed my eyes and allowed the adrenaline to slowly recede from my battered nervous system. Seeing Trent handcuffed on live television was a massive victory, a visceral validation of my survival. But the deep, hollow ache in my chest had nothing to do with my damaged lungs. I knew my parents. I knew exactly how they operated. Trent being arrested would not be seen as a consequence of his own murderous actions. It would be viewed as an inconvenience I had deliberately caused them. I did not have to wait long for my prediction to become reality. Less than 2 hours after the lobby confrontation, the heavy glass door to my hospital room violently swung open. It did not slide with the usual mechanical hiss. It was shoved so hard the tracking mechanism shuddered. My mother Brenda marched into the room, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. My father Richard followed closely behind her, pulling the door shut with a sharp snap. They looked entirely out of place in a trauma ward. Brenda was wearing her pristine tennis whites, her hair perfectly blown out, clutching a designer handbag like a shield. Richard wore his tailored golf slacks and a navy pullover. There were no tears in their eyes. There was no frantic rushing to my bedside to check my bandages or assess my breathing. There was only pure, unadulterated fury radiating from both of them. Are you trying to ruin your brother's life over a misunderstanding? Brenda snapped, stopping 2 feet from my bed. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask if I was in pain. Her voice was a harsh, venomous hiss designed to intimidate. I stared at her through the clear plastic of my oxygen mask. The sheer audacity of her opening statement actually took my breath away. A misunderstanding. My own mother was categorizing my brother leaving me to freeze to death as a simple miscommunication. I tapped my digital tablet, writing my response slowly, because my frostbitten fingers still ached. I turned the screen toward her. He stole my keys, stepped over my body, and left me in a blizzard. That is not a misunderstanding. That is attempted manslaughter. Richard scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. Do not be so utterly dramatic, Paige. He stepped closer to the bed, looming over me with the same oppressive posture he used to win corporate negotiations. You two had a disagreement over the cabin. You have always been prone to hysterics when you do not get your way. Trent said you stormed out onto the porch and slipped. He panicked because he had an urgent flight to catch to cover his margin calls. He did not know you were having an asthma attack. You are blowing this completely out of proportion to punish him. The cold detachment in my father's eyes was absolute. He had already accepted Trent's fabricated story because it was the most convenient narrative for his golden child. He did not care about the 4K security footage. He did not care that the chief of trauma had confirmed the severity of my condition. He only cared that his perfect son was currently sitting in a police precinct holding cell. You need to fix this right now, Brenda commanded, stepping closer to the rail of my hospital bed. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my face. You are going to call Detective Russo. You are going to tell him that your asthma attack caused severe hypoxia, making you hallucinate the events on the porch. You will say, Trent tried to help you but had to leave to find a cell signal. You will drop these ridiculous charges immediately. I glared at her, my fingers tightening around the edges of the digital tablet. I typed fiercely, ignoring the shooting pain in my joints. I am not lying to the police to save a man who tried to kill me. The security cameras captured everything. The audio is crystal clear. He told me I was a liability. He took my Rolex. He took my keys. He left me to die. Who cares about a stupid watch? Richard raised his voice, his face flushing red with indignation. Do you have any idea what you are doing to this family? The local news just ran the footage of Trent getting arrested in the lobby. Do you know how humiliating that is? We have the annual charity gala at the country club this weekend. Our friends are already calling asking why our son was handcuffed on television. You are making us a laughingstock in front of the entire board of directors. There it was. The absolute bottom line. My near-death experience was nothing more than a social inconvenience for them. I was lying in an intensive care unit, hooked up to life support machines, fighting for every single breath, and my parents were agonizing over their reputation at the country club. They were more concerned about answering awkward questions over cocktails than the fact that their daughter had almost returned to them in a body bag. Brenda leaned over the bed, lowering her voice to a harsh, threatening whisper. You listen to me, Paige. Your brother is on the verge of a major promotion. Jada is securing massive brand deals. They have a future. You sit alone in your data labs crunching numbers. You do not need the family name the way they do. If you do not call the police and retract your statement immediately, we will cut you off completely. We will publicly state that your mental health has deteriorated and that you are making these accusations out of jealousy. They expected me to cry. They expected the old Paige, the daughter who had spent 3 decades desperately craving their approval, to break down and apologize for causing trouble. They expected me to shrink back, sign whatever they wanted, and sacrifice my own reality to protect their golden child. But as I looked at their angry, selfish faces, I felt absolutely nothing. No tears threatened to spill. No familiar pang of guilt twisted in my stomach. The freezing snowstorm had not just killed the tissue in my extremities, it had killed the last remaining tether I had to these people. They were not my parents. They were just Trent's enablers. I maintained unbroken eye contact with my mother as I slowly reached my injured hand toward the side rail of my bed. I did not type another word on the tablet. I did not offer a single defense or justification. Instead, I pressed my thumb firmly against the large red emergency call button. Within seconds, the heavy glass door swung open. A large hospital security guard and a triage nurse stepped into the room. I tapped my stylus on the tablet one final time and turned the screen toward the nurse. These people are threatening me and elevating my heart rate. They are not authorized visitors. Please have security escort them off the premises permanently. Brenda gasped, her jaw dropping in sheer disbelief as the security guard stepped forward and firmly grasped Richard by the arm. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, her country club composure completely shattering. "We are your parents." I watched with cold, silent satisfaction as the guards physically corralled them out the door. Richard was shouting threats of disownment, while Brenda screamed about my selfishness. As the heavy glass door slid shut, silencing their toxic voices, the realization settled over me like a heavy protective armor. The entire family was officially against me, and I was absolutely ready to destroy them all. My first move was to assess the battlefield. I reached for my personal smartphone, which a nurse had kindly plugged into a charger near my tray table. I needed to begin gathering my own digital assets, locking down my corporate accounts, and preparing a watertight legal defense with Detective Russo. But before my frostbitten thumb could even unlock the home screen, the device began to vibrate violently in my hand. It was not a single phone call or a standard text message. It was a relentless machine gun rapid succession of notifications cascading down my screen faster than my eyes could track. They were all alerts from a major social media platform. Mentions, direct messages, and tags were multiplying by the thousands. I frowned, ignoring the sharp pain in my knuckles, and tapped the most recent notification. The app opened, and the perfectly curated, flawless face of my sister-in-law filled the screen. Jada was a master of the digital universe. As a highly successful African-American lifestyle influencer, she had built an empire of over 500,000 loyal followers by monetizing a carefully crafted illusion of perfection. She sold high-end wellness routines, luxury travel aesthetics, and the image of an aspirational, flawless marriage to a wealthy finance executive. Right now, she was using that massive platform to launch a coordinated lethal strike against my character. The video had been posted less than an hour ago, completely bypassing traditional media to weaponize her rabid fanbase directly. She was sitting in the immaculate living room of her Seattle penthouse. The lighting was soft and cinematic. She wore an oversized cashmere sweater, her usually perfect hair styled to look just the right amount of messy, creating the ultimate aesthetic of a woman pushed to the brink of emotional exhaustion. I turned up the volume on my phone, listening as her performance began. "My beautiful community." Jada spoke softly into the camera, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I usually come on here to share joy and positivity with you all. But today, my family is living through an absolute nightmare, and I need to speak the truth before the media twists our tragedy." She paused, bringing a manicured hand to wipe away a single perfectly placed tear. "Many of you have seen the horrific local news footage of my husband Trent being arrested at a hospital. What the news did not tell you is the heartbreaking reality of what we have been dealing with behind closed doors. My sister-in-law Paige has been battling a severe prescription pill addiction for years. We have tried everything to help her. We have offered to pay for rehab. We have staged interventions. We have given her nothing but love and support." My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. She was not just lying. She was weaponizing the language of mental health and addiction to assassinate my credibility. Jada looked directly into the camera lens, her expression shifting to one of profound tragic pity. "This weekend at our family cabin in Aspen, Paige suffered a massive drug-induced hallucination. She became violent, stole some items from the house, and wandered out into a deadly blizzard in a complete state of psychosis. My husband risked his own life searching the woods for her all night. When she was finally rescued by a snowplow driver and brought to the hospital, we thought our prayers were answered. We rushed to be by her side. She let out a ragged, cinematic sob covering her mouth, as if overcome by the weight of the betrayal. Instead of getting the psychiatric help she desperately needs, Paige is now using this tragedy to extort us. She is demanding we hand over our family properties to fund her habit, and she filed completely fabricated malicious police reports against my husband to force our hand. Addiction is a terrible disease. It turns the people you love into monsters who will do anything for their next fix. We are choosing to set hard boundaries to protect our family, but we are completely devastated. Please keep Trent in your prayers while we fight to clear his name. The video ended. I stared at the screen, my analytical mind instantly dissecting the brilliance of her strategy. It was a masterful, devastating piece of digital warfare. By framing me as a severely unstable addict suffering from hallucinations, Jada had provided a convenient, socially acceptable explanation for why I was found wandering in the snow. She turned Trent from a cold-blooded attempted murderer into a tragic, self-sacrificing hero dealing with a toxic family member. Best of all, she had preemptively discredited any evidence I might bring forward, painting the security footage and police reports as the malicious fabrications of an addict trying to extort money. I looked at the metrics beneath the video. It already had 300,000 views and was climbing exponentially with every refresh. The comment section was an absolute bloodbath. Jada had cultivated a fan base that operated like a loyal army, and she had just pointed them directly at me. Influencers and minor celebrities were chiming in, leaving heart emojis and messages of support for Jada and Trent, praising them for their bravery in dealing with such a toxic family member. They commended her for setting boundaries. The narrative had been successfully hijacked and completely inverted in the court of public opinion. Then the digital attack escalated from a public smear campaign to a targeted personal assault. Somehow, whether through a deliberate leak by Jada or the relentless digging of her rabid followers, my personal cell phone number and private social media handles had been broadcast to the mob. My phone screen lit up, completely freezing for a second, under the sheer volume of incoming data. The notifications transformed into an endless scrolling waterfall of pure digital venom. Direct messages flooded my inbox. Text messages from unknown numbers bombarded my screen. "You are a disgusting junkie. How dare you try to ruin an innocent man's life to buy more pills? You should have frozen to death in that snowbank. I hope the police lock you up in a psych ward forever." The device grew physically hot in my hand as hundreds of hate messages poured in every single minute. Strangers from all over the country, people who knew absolutely nothing about me or the truth of that freezing night in Aspen, were actively wishing for my death. The viral mob was relentless, blind, and terrifyingly efficient. I was trapped in a hospital bed, physically broken, and now entirely isolated under the crushing weight of a nationwide smear campaign. The onslaught of hatred continued to explode across my screen, burying me in a brand new kind of storm. The onslaught of hatred continued to explode across my screen, burying me in a brand new kind of storm. The device vibrated so aggressively it threatened to slip from my heavily bandaged fingers. I navigated straight to the settings menu and forcefully deactivated every single social media alert. The sudden digital silence in my hospital room was immediate, but the damage was already accelerating beyond my control. As a healthcare data analytics director, my entire professional existence is predicated on absolute data integrity, ironclad security clearance, and unshakable trustworthiness. I manage systems that audit pharmaceutical distribution and enforce HIPAA compliance frameworks across nationwide hospital networks. If the public believed I was a compromised addict wandering around in psychotic hazes, my career was functionally dead. My phone vibrated again. It was not another hate message from one of Jada's rabid followers. The caller ID displayed the name David Preston, the chief executive officer of my firm. David was a ruthlessly pragmatic, numbers-driven man who had recruited me specifically to overhaul the corporate compliance architecture. I swiped the green icon and brought the device to my ear, bracing myself for the impact. "Paige, tell me you are safe and recovering," David said. His voice was strained, lacking its usual confident corporate boom. "I am in the intensive care unit, David. I survived," I replied, my voice still a harsh, painful rasp from the freezing air. "I saw the local news reports about Trent getting arrested in the lobby." David continued, his tone shifting rapidly into careful corporate diplomacy. And then the board of directors forwarded me a video your sister-in-law posted online, the one that currently has over 2 million views and is trending nationally. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the stiff hospital pillows. David, every single word in that video is a fabricated lie designed to cover up an attempted manslaughter charge. I do not have a prescription pill addiction. I was physically attacked and left to freeze to death. I want to believe you, Paige. Personally, I really do. David sighed heavily. But professionally, my hands are entirely tied. Our firm manages the highly sensitive medical records of over 14 million patients. Your specific division audits controlled substance tracking and hospital compliance. The board of directors held an emergency meeting 20 minutes ago. Our top 3 hospital network clients have already called our legal department, threatening to suspend their multi-million-dollar contracts. They absolutely cannot have a lead director with top-level security clearance publicly trending under allegations of severe prescription drug addiction and psychosis. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen all over again. You are suspending me. Effective immediately. David confirmed, the regret evident in his voice, but ultimately useless to my survival. You are placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full corporate investigation and the absolute resolution of these legal matters. Your corporate access credentials have already been revoked. Your company laptop and secure servers are locked down. I am incredibly sorry, Paige. Get better. Clear your name, then we can talk about bringing you back. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. In the span of 48 hours, Trent and Jada had successfully stripped me of everything. My brother took my physical safety and attempted to steal my inheritance. My parents took my family foundation by actively defending the man who tried to kill me. Now Jada had taken my reputation, my income, and my daily professional purpose. I was entirely cut off from the career I had spent 10 years building from the ground up. Dr. Thorne entered the room an hour later with a thick stack of discharge papers. My oxygen levels were finally stable enough for outpatient recovery, though my fingers remained heavily wrapped to protect the recovering tissue from the early-stage frostbite. A hospital social worker followed closely behind her, dropping off a clear plastic bag containing the few personal items recovered from my coat pockets out on the ice. I slowly pulled myself out of the hospital bed. Every single muscle in my body screamed in violent protest. The massive purple and black bruises blooming across my ribs and hips served as a painful reminder of my violent fall against the icy porch railing. Because my own clothes had been cut away during the emergency trauma admission, I was forced to change into a set of standard gray hospital scrubs provided by the nursing staff. The coarse fabric rubbed against my raw, scraped skin, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself to dress independently. Standing in front of the small bathroom mirror, I stared critically at my own reflection. I looked physically destroyed. My skin was pale and hollow, my lips were cracked and bleeding, and a stark white bandage covered a deep laceration on my cheekbone. I had absolutely no job to return to on Monday morning. I had no family to call for a ride home. I had an army of internet strangers actively praying for my downfall. Yet as I walked back to the bed and signed the final discharge paperwork with my injured hand, I did not shed a single tear. The panic was completely gone. The lingering childhood desire for my parents' validation had evaporated into the sterile hospital air. Jada thought she won the war by controlling the social media narrative with her manufactured tears. Trent thought he could hide behind his high-priced defense lawyers and our parents' country club influence. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed I would react like a broken, helpless victim. They forgot that I dismantle complex data architectures for a living. I find the hidden flaws, I trace the anomalies, and I ruthlessly expose the truth using undeniable metrics. I stepped out of the hospital, sliding doors into the freezing Seattle rain. My body was battered, bruised, and officially stripped of its daily life, but my analytical brain was now operating with ice-cold clarity. I hailed a rideshare from the hospital curb, sliding into the back seat of a quiet, scentless sedan. The driver did not ask questions about my oversized gray hospital scrubs or the thick white bandages wrapping my hands for which I was profoundly grateful. As we navigated the slick, rain-soaked streets of Seattle, I rigidly compartmentalized my immediate tasks to keep the physical pain at bay. Step 1 was securing my physical environment. My home office contained a fireproof safe with encrypted backup drives, hardware ledgers, and emergency cash. Step 2 was initiating a total financial lockdown of all my personal accounts before my parents could attempt any further manipulation. The vehicle pulled up to my modern 3-story townhouse. I thanked the driver, stepped out into the freezing downpour, and walked up the paved driveway. My property was my sanctuary. I had purchased it outright 3 years ago with the corporate bonuses I earned designing predictive healthcare models. It was the one place where the toxic reach of my family had never been allowed to penetrate. I had explicitly designed my life to be a fortress of independence. I reached the covered front porch and extended my bruised index finger to the biometric smart lock on the heavy front door. I pressed my thumb against the glass sensor. A sharp double beep sounded, and the LED indicator flashed a bright solid red. Access denied. I frowned, wiping a drop of cold rain from the sensor, assuming the moisture or my damaged skin was interfering with the optical read. I moved my hand to the keypad and entered my highly secure 6-digit master passcode. Another harsh double beep echoed on the porch. The red light flashed again. The master code had been entirely wiped from the system firmware. A cold spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream momentarily, overriding the dull ache in my fractured ribs. I reached into the plastic hospital belongings bag and pulled out my physical backup key. I slid the metal into the manual override cylinder beneath the keypad. It refused to turn. I pulled the key back out and looked closely at the locking mechanism. The brass cylinder was completely different from the one I had installed. I looked down and noticed fresh, tiny metallic shavings dusted across the welcome mat. The entire lock had been professionally drilled out and replaced within the last 24 hours. Before I could fully process the massive legal violation of someone changing the locks on my primary residence, the motion-activated porch light clicked to a brighter setting. A shadow moved across the frosted glass sidelight panel of my front door. I took a cautious step backward as the interior foyer lights blazed on. Standing right inside my house, protected by the heavy reinforced glass, were my brother and my sister-in-law. Trent was not wearing a bright orange county jail jumpsuit. He was dressed in a pristine dark charcoal athleisure set, holding a steaming mug of my expensive imported coffee. Our parents had moved with lightning speed, leveraging their massive wealth and high-priced defense attorneys to post what must have been an astronomical bail for an attempted manslaughter charge. They had prioritized getting their golden child out of a holding cell over checking if I could breathe on my own. Beside him stood Jada. She was no longer wearing the oversized tear-stained sweater from her viral extortion video. She wore a sleek designer jumpsuit, her hair perfectly smoothed back into a tight bun. She held her smartphone casually in one hand, the screen completely dark. She did not need to perform for an audience right now. The fake crying influencer mask was completely off, revealing the greedy, calculating opportunist underneath. I stared at them through the glass, the freezing rain soaking right through my thin hospital scrubs. They had broken into my house. They had invaded my only safe haven. I stepped forward and pounded my fist against the heavy door, ignoring the sharp flare of pain radiating through my damaged knuckles. "Get out of my house!" I shouted, my voice hoarse but echoing loudly on the quiet residential street. "You are trespassing. I am calling the police right now." Trent did not flinch. He took a slow, arrogant sip from his coffee mug and smiled. It was a hollow, dead-eyed smile that sent a wave of absolute disgust churning through my stomach. He gestured casually for Jada to step forward. Jada walked right up to the glass. She did not bother to unlock or open the door. Instead, she knelt down near the heavy weather stripping at the base of the threshold. She pushed a thick, folded manila envelope through the narrow metal mail slot at the bottom of the door. It dropped onto my wet porch mat with a soft thud. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at their smug faces. I crouched down slowly, my bruised ribs screaming in protest, and picked up the heavy paper packet. My bandaged fingers tore the seal open. Inside were several pages of dense, highly structured legal documents printed on the heavy stock paper favored by elite corporate law firms. I scanned the bold black text at the top of the first page. Emergency petition for temporary conservatorship. Attached beneath it was a second equally terrifying legal filing. Temporary medical power of attorney. My analytical brain instantly decoded the devastating legal trap they had just sprung. They had weaponized my emergency trauma admission. They used the severe hypoxia, the hypothermia, and the completely fabricated narrative of my severe psychological breakdown to file an emergency ex parte petition in family court. They had leveraged Jada's viral video and my parents' immense financial resources to convince a judge that I was an active danger to myself. They were using the exact same legal framework designed to protect vulnerable patients as a weapon to strip me of my bodily autonomy and my financial independence. By establishing a temporary medical power of attorney and pending conservatorship, Trent now had the presumed legal authority to occupy my residence, access my bank accounts, and make binding decisions on my behalf. They were not just trying to steal the Aspen cabin anymore. They were actively executing a hostile takeover of my entire life. They desperately needed control of my tech company shares and my liquid assets to cover Trent's massive embezzlement debts before the federal authorities caught wind of his financial crimes. I looked up from the terrifying legal documents. The rain was freezing against my skin, but a new, unquenchable fire was burning intensely in my chest. I stepped right up to the glass, bringing my face mere inches from Jada. Jada leaned forward on the other side, her perfectly painted lips curling into a wicked, triumphant smile. Her voice carried clearly through the thick glass of the door laced with absolute malice. "You're legally unfit, Paige," Jada sneered through the glass. "We're taking control of your assets to help you recover." I stared at her perfectly contoured face, watching the sheer malicious joy radiating from her eyes. 5 years ago, the old me would have screamed until my vocal cords bled. I would have shattered that glass, begging for my own home, handing them the exact hysterical reaction they needed to prove their fabricated narrative to any passing police cruiser. Instead, I simply turned my back on them and walked away. The freezing rain battered my gray hospital scrubs as I marched down the driveway. I did not look back. I reached into the hidden lining of my bra, retrieving the emergency titanium encrypted flash drive and the thick fold of high-denomination bills I always kept vacuum-sealed for absolute worst-case scenarios. Working in cybersecurity and healthcare data teaches you to prepare for systemic collapse. Today, the collapsing system was my own family. I flagged down a passing city cab and handed the driver a crisp $100 bill, directing him to the Apex Grand. It was a fortress of a hotel catering strictly to visiting tech executives and foreign diplomats, boasting autonomous elevator protocols and highly restricted floor access. I paid for a week upfront in cash, under a corporate alias I maintained for security audits. The suite was vast, sterile, and perfectly silent. I locked the heavy deadbolt, engaged the secondary security latch, and stripped off the damp, coarse hospital scrubs. After a scalding hot shower that sent agonizing spikes of pain through my bruised ribs, I wrapped myself in a thick terry cloth robe. I sat down at the heavy mahogany desk, switched on the ambient desk lamp, and spread the damp legal documents across the polished wood. I needed to dissect their trap. The emergency petition for temporary conservatorship was a masterpiece of weaponized legal loopholes. My parents had spared absolutely no expense. They had retained a bulldog law firm known for aggressive corporate takeovers, effectively treating my life as a hostile acquisition. But the cornerstone of their entire petition rested on a single medical affidavit. I traced my injured finger down the page to the signature line. Dr. Silas Montgomery. A quick search on the hotel room tablet confirmed my suspicions. Montgomery was a high-priced, heavily sanctioned psychiatrist who catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy. He functioned as a legal hitman in a white coat. He made a lucrative living rubber-stamping competency evaluations for rich families looking to quiet down inconvenient heirs or seize control of trust funds. Montgomery had signed a sworn statement declaring me a severe danger to myself, citing acute substance withdrawal and post-traumatic psychosis resulting from the blizzard. He had never even spoken to me. He diagnosed me entirely based on Jada's viral video and a heavily redacted forged hospital admission report my parents likely bribed a rogue administrator to produce. The American legal system has a terrifying blind spot when it comes to ex parte conservatorship hearings. A judge can temporarily strip away your fundamental civil liberties without you even being present in the courtroom, provided the medical affidavits look legitimate. Once you are locked in the system, escaping is a bureaucratic nightmare. You lose your right to hire your own attorney, access your own money, or even refuse forced medical treatments. My family was trying to legally bury me alive. The sheer audacity of the legal maneuvering was staggering, but my analytical mind zeroed in on the numbers. Why go to such extreme lengths? Why risk federal fraud charges to lock me in a conservatorship? I reviewed the asset schedule attached to the petition. Trent had listed himself as the primary fiduciary guardian. If a judge approved the final order next week, Trent would gain unilateral unchecked access to my corporate stock options, my real estate portfolio, and my offshore liquid capital. Trent was not just greedy, he was a desperate drowning animal. My brother was a vice president at a massive investment fund, living a lifestyle that vastly exceeded his legitimate compensation. Jada's influencer facade required a terrifying amount of overhead. Private jets, custom wardrobes, luxury leases all cost a fortune. I knew my brother's salary. It could not possibly support the millions they burned through annually. Trent was drowning in hidden debts, likely margin calls, or embezzled client funds that were about to come due. He needed a massive, untraceable cash injection immediately, and my grandmother's cabin had just been the appetizer. When I refused to sign over the Aspen property, he realized he needed the whole treasury. He left me to freeze to death so he could inherit it all. When the snowplow ruined his murder plot, my parents scrambled to execute Plan B. They would lock me in a psychiatric facility, declare me legally incompetent, and let Trent drain my accounts dry to save himself from federal prison. They chose to sacrifice my freedom and my sanity to protect their golden child from facing the consequences of his own financial crimes. They had cornered me in the physical world and the legal world. They had locked me out of my house, frozen my traditional bank accounts, and turned the public against me. But they fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield. They thought power resided in country club connections, viral social media tears, and forged legal signatures. They did not understand that true power in the modern age resides entirely in data. I reached into my bag and pulled out the encrypted titanium flash drive. I walked over to the high-end smart television mounted on the wall, bypassing the hotel network by booting up a secure, untraceable operating system directly from my drive. The screen flickered from the hotel welcome menu to a stark black command terminal. I bypassed the standard firewalls, establishing a secure tunnel directly to my company's hidden backup servers. My bruised, bandaged fingers hovered over the glass keyboard. I had spent my entire life trying to be the good daughter, trying to earn the love of parents who viewed me as nothing more than a spare parts depository for their golden child. That version of Paige froze to death on a porch in Aspen. The woman sitting in this hotel room was a highly trained data architect holding the digital keys to the global financial system. I opened my secure laptop. It was time to stop reacting and start hunting. I powered up my secure laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard despite the lingering ache from the cold. The sterile quiet of the hotel room was a stark contrast to the chaotic storm I had barely survived and the legal storm currently raging around me. But here in the digital realm, I was the one in control. My first target was Trent. I needed to understand the exact shape and scale of his desperation. He was a vice president at Vanguard Capital, a mid-sized but aggressive investment fund. His official salary, while substantial, could not possibly cover the exorbitant lifestyle Jada constantly flaunted on her social media channels. I started by pulling up Vanguard Capital's publicly available filings. I wrote a quick Python script to scrape their quarterly reports cross-referencing their declared assets under management with the specific portfolios Trent managed. The numbers were complex, intentionally obfuscated by layers of corporate jargon, but to me they were just data points waiting to be organized. I built a dynamic dashboard plotting Trent's portfolio performance over the past 5 years. The trend line was initially steady, but then about 18 months ago it became erratic. Sharp, inexplicable dips followed by sudden, aggressive recoveries. It looked less like strategic investing and more like high-stakes gambling. Next, I turned my attention to Jada's digital footprint. I didn't need to hack into her private accounts. She broadcasted her life to 500,000 followers daily. I used an image recognition API to scan her Instagram and TikTok feeds, cataloging every designer handbag, every first-class flight to Dubai or Paris, every piece of custom jewelry. I built a secondary dataset assigning estimated retail values to each item. The results were staggering. Jada's documented spending over the last 18 months exceeded Trent's entire estimated gross salary by a factor of 3. Even accounting for her influencer sponsorships, which I analyzed by tracking engagement metrics and standard industry conversion rates, the math simply did not work. They were burning through millions of dollars they did not legitimately possess. I needed to find the bridge between Trent's erratic portfolio performance and Jada's astronomical spending. I dove into the murky waters of shell companies and offshore accounts. I used specialized search protocols to scan public registries in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming states, known for corporate anonymity. I searched for variations of Trent's name, Jada's maiden name, and even the names of their childhood pets. Hours bled into the night. The hotel room remained silent except for the rapid clicking of my keys. My eyes ached, but the thrill of the hunt kept me focused. I finally found a thread, a Delaware LLC named Aegis Holdings, registered just 2 weeks before the first major dip in Trent's portfolio performance. The registered agent was a notoriously shady law firm, but the digital breadcrumbs led me to a secondary filing in the Cayman Islands. I bypassed a weak firewall on a Cayman registry database, exploiting an outdated security protocol I had flagged in a vulnerability audit 3 years ago. The documents revealed that Aegis Holdings was a holding company for a series of offshore accounts. I ran a cross-referencing algorithm matching the dates of major withdrawals from Trent's client portfolios at Vanguard Capital with the dates of deposits into the Aegis Holdings accounts. The correlation was undeniable. The data points aligned perfectly, a digital fingerprint of massive financial fraud. Trent was not just making bad investments. He was actively skimming millions from his clients, funneling the money through Aegis Holdings and using it to fund Jada's influencer empire. The margin calls he had screamed about at the cabin were not market fluctuations. They were desperate attempts to cover the missing funds before the quarterly audits caught up with him. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was breathtaking. My brother was not just a greedy, desperate man. He was a master manipulator running a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme, and he was willing to kill me to keep it hidden. I leaned back in the ergonomic hotel chair, staring at the glowing data models on my screen. The numbers painted a clear, irrefutable picture of absolute ruin for Trent and Jada. But I needed the final piece of the puzzle, the definitive proof that tied the stolen funds directly to their personal accounts. I ran one last query targeting the banking transactions linked to Jada's primary influencer, LLC. The progress bar crawled across the screen, the algorithm sifting through millions of data packets. My heart pounded a steady adrenaline-fueled rhythm against my bruised ribs. The query completed. The screen populated with a detailed transaction log. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the rows of data. And there it was. A massive recurring wire transfer from an account linked directly to Aegis Holdings, deposited straight into Jada's primary business account. The memo line simply read, "Consulting fees." I had hit the jackpot. The discrepancy in the numbers was not just a rounding error, it was a $4.5 million gaping hole in Trent's client portfolios, a hole he had tried to fill with my inheritance and my life. The smoking gun was right there, glowing brightly on my screen, waiting to be unleashed. I stared at the transaction logs, the harsh blue light of the monitor reflecting in my tired eyes. $4.5 million. It was not a single panicked theft. It was a systematic, calculated draining of client assets executed over 18 months with terrifying precision. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I dug deeper into the architecture of his fraud. Trent was not just skimming off the top of his investment fund. He was identifying older, less active clients at Vanguard Capital, people who trusted him implicitly and rarely checked their digital portals. He siphoned their principal investments into Aegis Holdings under the guise of high-yield offshore ventures. From there, the money was washed clean through the Cayman Islands and wired directly into Jada's influencer enterprise. Jada was not just a clueless beneficiary of her husband's crimes. She was the primary launderer. Her lifestyle brand was the perfect front. By claiming the stolen millions as consulting fees and brand sponsorships, she integrated the dirty money into the legitimate banking system. Every designer bag she flaunted, every luxury vacation she vlogged, and every high-end dinner she posted was actively funded by the retirement savings of Trent's unsuspecting clients. They were a modern-day criminal syndicate operating behind the glossy filter of social media perfection. But financial fraud of this magnitude creates an inevitable ticking clock. I pulled up Vanguard Capital's corporate calendar. There it was. The annual mandatory third-party audits were scheduled to begin this upcoming Monday morning. The entire timeline clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The margin calls Trent screamed about at the cabin were not related to market volatility. He was facing a massive, unavoidable audit that would instantly expose the missing $4.5 million. He needed an immediate massive influx of clean cash to replace the stolen funds before the auditors arrived. That was why he needed our grandmother's cabin. He needed a hard, unencumbered asset worth millions to secure a rapid bridge loan from a private lender. When I refused to sign the deed over to him on that freezing porch, I did not just deny him money. I essentially handed him a federal prison sentence. The realization sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Trent stepping over my convulsing body in the snow was not a moment of panic. It was a cold, calculated pivot in his criminal strategy. If I died in the blizzard, he would automatically inherit my entire estate, including my tech company shares and my half of the cabin. My death was the ultimate financial bailout for his embezzlement scheme. He was willing to let his own sister suffocate and freeze to death to keep his white-collar crimes hidden from the auditors. And my parents were actively aiding him. By filing the emergency conservatorship to declare me mentally unfit, they were attempting to seize my assets to save him perfectly, willing to sacrifice my freedom and my sanity to protect their golden child. I leaned back in the ergonomic hotel chair, my bruised ribs aching in protest. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was staggering, but I could not afford the luxury of emotional devastation. I needed to weaponize this data. I opened a new, highly encrypted folder on my secure desktop and began compiling the digital dossier. I did not just save the raw data. I organized it meticulously the way a prosecutor would build a grand jury presentation. I created a master spreadsheet tracking every single stolen dollar from the moment it left a Vanguard Capital client account to the exact second it landed in Jada's business checking account. I exported the shell company registration documents from Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I attached the forged consulting invoices I found buried in Jada's public business filings. I mapped out the entire money laundering network using a visual data linking tool, creating undeniable connecting lines between Trent's corporate terminal and the offshore routing numbers. I worked relentlessly through the early hours of the morning. My frostbitten fingers throbbed, but I refused to stop until the dossier was absolutely bulletproof. I cross-referenced the transaction timestamps with Jada's social media posts, proving that her lavish spending sprees directly correlated with the exact days Trent siphoned money from his elderly clients. It was a masterpiece of forensic data analytics wrapped in military-grade encryption. When the dossier was finally complete, I sat back and stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. I had the power to destroy them completely. The question was how to deploy it for maximum impact. My first instinct was to send the encrypted folder to Detective Russo. He was already investigating Trent for attempted manslaughter. But I quickly dismissed the idea. Russo was an excellent local detective, but local police departments simply do not have the jurisdiction, the resources, or the specialized forensic accountants required to instantly freeze international shell companies and untangle offshore wire fraud. If I gave this to the local authorities, Trent's high-priced defense lawyers would tie it up in jurisdictional disputes for months. My parents could potentially post bail for state-level assault charges. They could use their wealth and their country club influence to muddy the waters, bribe witnesses, and drag the legal process out until I was financially exhausted. I needed a weapon they could not bribe. I needed a force of nature that cared absolutely nothing about their social status or their carefully curated public image. Federal wire fraud and international tax evasion are completely different beasts. When the federal government decides to take you down, they do not just arrest you. They freeze every bank account you own. They seize your properties. They lock your assets so thoroughly that you cannot even hire a defense attorney without their permission. I opened my secure, untraceable email client. I bypassed the local authorities entirely. I addressed the first message to the special agent in charge of the white-collar crime division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I addressed the second message to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I attached the encrypted dossier to both emails. I did not write a long emotional plea. I simply provided the decryption keys and a single sentence outlining the $4.5 million embezzlement and money laundering operation currently being executed by a vice president at Vanguard Capital. I hovered my cursor over the send button. The hotel room was completely silent, the city of Seattle just beginning to wake up outside my window. Jada had sent me a taunting text warning me to pack my bags for the psych ward. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she had already won. With a single decisive click of my mouse, I sent the emails. The data vanished into the federal servers, triggering an avalanche they would never see coming. I closed the laptop, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across my bruised face. It was time to get dressed for my parents' anniversary gala. The federal servers absorbed my encrypted data packets in absolute silence. There were no blaring sirens. There were no flashing lights outside my hotel window. The digital execution of my brother and sister-in-law had been completely noiseless, but the shockwave was already traveling toward them at the speed of light. I closed the laptop, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across my bruised face. My smartphone vibrated aggressively against the polished mahogany desk. I glanced down at the glowing screen. A new text message from Jada had just arrived, cutting through the quiet of my secure suite. "See you in court on Monday. Pack your bags for the psych ward." I stared at the notification, feeling an incredible sense of detachment. A few days ago, a threat like that would have sent me into a blind panic. It would have triggered my asthma and sent me spiraling into a desperate, messy attempt to defend my own sanity. Now it was just pathetic. Jada was sitting in her luxury Seattle penthouse, blindly confident in her fabricated reality, completely unaware that her entire influencer empire was currently being dismantled by federal agents. I did not reply. I did not block her. I simply swiped left and deleted the message thread entirely. Engaging with a ghost was a massive waste of my time. I needed to prepare for the evening. I picked up the hotel room phone and dialed the premium concierge service. I requested an emergency personal shopper, providing my exact measurements, my corporate credit card, and highly specific wardrobe requirements. 2 hours later, a sleek black garment bag was delivered directly to my suite. I stepped out of my thick terry cloth robe and carefully dressed myself. The suit was a razor-sharp, bespoke, tailored masterpiece in a deep, striking emerald green. It commanded immediate attention and radiated absolute authority. The structured blazer perfectly concealed the heavy medical bandaging wrapped tight around my fractured ribs. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and pointed toe heels that clicked against the hardwood floor like a ticking clock. I sat in front of the brightly lit vanity mirror and meticulously applied my makeup. I used a high-coverage foundation to mask the pale, hollow exhaustion in my cheeks and the fading purple bruises along my jawline. I highlighted my eyes to look sharp and completely awake. However, I did not bother covering the stark white bandage resting on my temple. That bandage was not a flaw. It was a highly visible receipt of my survival. It was a physical reminder to everyone in my family of exactly what they had tried to do to me. My physical armor secured, I shifted my focus to my tactical alliances. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to Dr. Eris Thorne. She answered on the second ring, her voice as clinical and sharp as ever. "Paige, tell me you are resting." "I am preparing," I corrected her. "I need an update on Silas Montgomery." I heard the satisfying sound of heavy paper files shifting on her end of the line. "The hospital legal board moved with unprecedented speed," Dr. Thorne confirmed. "Montgomery made a fatal, arrogant error when he rubber-stamped that psychiatric hold for your parents. He referenced your emergency trauma admission here at our specific facility. He actively falsified official hospital records to support his bogus diagnosis. Our legal team just filed a massive medical fraud complaint with the state licensing board. We also forwarded the forgery evidence directly to the district attorney." I smiled at my reflection in the mirror. So his career is over. Montgomery is facing immediate suspension of his medical license and severe criminal charges for HIPAA violations, Dr. Thorne stated proudly. "Your parents' conservatorship petition is completely dead on arrival. The medical affidavit supporting their entire legal strategy is now classified as fraudulent evidence." "Thank you, Dr. Thorne," I said, a genuine wave of relief washing over my tense shoulders. They thought they could buy a diagnosis with their country club money. They forgot they were dealing with the chief of trauma. "Nobody weaponizes my emergency room," she replied coldly. "Give them hell tonight, Paige." I disconnected the call and immediately dialed Detective Russo. His gravelly voice came through the speaker instantly. "I hope you are calling to tell me you are safe in a secure location, Ms. Gallagher. I am currently secure detective, but I am changing locations tonight," I informed him, pacing across the luxury carpet. "My parents are hosting their 40th anniversary gala at the Crestview Country Club. The entire board of directors from Vanguard Capital will be there. Trent and Jada will be the guests of honor." Detective Russo let out a low warning whistle. "You are walking right into the lion's den. Trent is out on a massive bail, but you have a protective order in place. I can have patrol cars there in 10 minutes to arrest him for violating it." "Do not send local patrol cars," I instructed him smoothly. "I am not looking for a simple restraining order violation. I need you to be on standby, detective. Things are going to escalate far beyond local jurisdiction tonight." I forwarded a very specific set of financial data to the federal authorities early this morning. The line went dead silent for a long moment as Russo processed the immense implication. "You brought the feds into this." "I brought the ultimate consequence into this," I corrected. "Trent embezzled $4.5 million from his clients. Jada laundered it through her business accounts. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service are already reviewing the routing numbers. The margin calls Trent panicked over are actually mandatory corporate audits starting on Monday morning. He is a cornered animal." Detective Russo let out a sharp, impressed exhale. "If the feds are moving on a wire fraud case of that magnitude, they will not wait for Monday. They move extremely fast to prevent asset destruction and flight risks. I will coordinate with the local federal field office and hold a perimeter with my squad. We will let the federal agents take the absolute lead, but I want to be there when they put him in the back of the transport vehicle. I will see you at the country club, detective." I ended the call and walked back over to the mahogany desk. I unplugged my encrypted flash drive from the laptop and dropped it into a sleek black leather briefcase. I added pristine physical copies of the bank routing numbers, the forged medical affidavit, and the offshore shell company registrations. I snapped the metallic clasps shut. The sound echoed with absolute finality in the quiet hotel suite. I grabbed my rental car keys and my tailored overcoat. I walked out of the suite, rode the autonomous elevator down to the secure underground parking garage, and stepped into the waiting vehicle. The Seattle rain had finally stopped leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the amber streetlights. I placed the leather briefcase carefully on the passenger seat. I was no longer the desperate, suffocating victim crawling through the aspen snow. I was the architect of their total destruction, and I was heading straight to their celebration. The tires of my rental car crunched smoothly over the crushed white gravel lining the sprawling circular driveway of the Crestview Country Club. The imposing Georgian architecture of the clubhouse loomed against the dark Seattle sky, illuminated by dozens of strategically placed architectural spotlights. A valet in a crisp uniform hurried forward to open my door. I handed him the keys, grabbed the sleek leather briefcase from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the crisp night air. I walked through the massive double doors of the main entrance, my heels clicking assertively against the polished marble floor. The lobby was a masterclass in quiet generational wealth. Massive floral centerpieces overflowing with white orchids sat on antique tables. I bypassed the cloakroom, keeping my tailored overcoat draped over my arm to conceal the heavy medical bandages wrapping my ribs, though my emerald green designer suit commanded attention all on its own. At the end of the grand corridor lay the entrance to the main ballroom. Two uniformed ushers stood at attention, ready to pull the heavy mahogany doors open. I gave them a sharp, singular nod. They pulled the handles simultaneously, revealing the absolute pinnacle of Seattle high society. The ballroom was spectacular, bathed in the warm, golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of guests mingled in bespoke tuxedos and floor-length evening gowns. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne flutes. On a raised stage at the far end of the room, a highly paid string quartet was playing a flawless rendition of a classical concerto. I immediately recognized several key figures in the crowd. The entire board of directors from Vanguard Capital was present, nursing top-shelf scotch and laughing at polite jokes. The wealth in this single room was astronomical. I stepped over the threshold. For the first 30 seconds, I was just another guest arriving late. Then a woman standing near the entrance turned to glance at me. Her champagne flute froze halfway to her mouth. She nudged her husband, who turned and stared. The recognition spread through the ballroom like a drop of ink in a glass of water. Jada had ensured that half the country had seen my face attached to a fabricated story of severe addiction and psychotic delusions. To these elite socialites, I was not Paige Gallagher, the successful data analytics director. I was the unhinged, dangerous liability who had wandered into a blizzard and tried to extort her poor suffering brother. The ripple effect was immediate. The polite murmur of high society conversation began to falter, replaced by a rising tide of harsh, frantic whispers. People visibly stepped back, clearing a wide path in front of me, as if my alleged psychiatric breakdown was highly contagious. The sudden, unnatural shift in the room's energy caught the attention of the string quartet. The first violinist lost his place, letting out a sharp, discordant screech of the bow. The music ground to a completely awkward, highly visible halt. In the sudden, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom, the sharp click of my pointed heels echoed like gunshots as I walked purposefully forward. Across the room, the crowd parted to reveal my parents. Brenda and Richard were standing near the main bar with the Vanguard Capital CEO. When they saw me, all the color drained from their faces. Brenda's jaw dropped, her perfect country club smile shattering instantly. Richard's eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated fury. They excused themselves from the CEO and marched directly toward me, navigating the sea of staring guests with frantic, aggressive strides. They intercepted me in the center of the ballroom. Brenda grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging viciously into my blazer sleeve. "What on earth do you think you are doing here?" Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage, desperate to keep the confrontation quiet enough for polite society. "You need to turn around and leave right now before you embarrass yourself further." I easily twisted my arm out of her grip, smoothing the emerald fabric of my sleeve without breaking eye contact. "I am not the one who is going to be embarrassed tonight, Mother." Richard stepped closer, attempting to use his large frame to physically block my path to the stage. "You are out of your mind, Paige," he threatened, his voice a low, gravelly growl. "You are officially legally unfit. We filed the temporary conservatorship papers this afternoon. If you do not walk out those doors voluntarily in the next 10 seconds, I will have the club security drag you out and drop you directly into a psychiatric transport vehicle." Before I could dissect the absolute failure of their legal trap, Trent and Jada materialized from the crowd. Trent looked incredibly smug wearing a custom-fitted velvet tuxedo jacket. He held a glass of bourbon, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who firmly believed he had won the war. Jada stood right beside him, her arm looped through his, wearing a sympathetic, highly manufactured frown for the benefit of the watching audience. Trent looked down at the sleek leather briefcase gripped tightly in my hand. A greasy, victorious smirk spread across his face. "Well, well," Trent said loudly, ensuring the nearby Vanguard executives could hear his magnanimous tone. "Look who decided to come back to reality. Did you finally bring the signed Aspen deed page? Or did you just come to beg for your allowance back? We told you we would help fund your rehab once you surrendered control of your accounts. You do not have to make a scene to get our help." Jada let out a soft, theatrical sigh. "We just want you to get better, Paige. Please do not do this to yourself in front of Trent's investors." I looked at my brother, taking in his relaxed posture, his expensive watch, and the absolute certainty in his eyes that he had successfully buried my life to save his own. I looked at Jada, playing the victimized saint. I looked at my parents, standing as the impenetrable wall of protection around their golden child. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. I simply looked Trent dead in the eye and delivered a calm, entirely emotionless response. "Your audit starts on Monday morning at Vanguard Capital, Trent. I just thought I would save the compliance team some overtime." Trent's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. His eyes darted to the leather briefcase, a sudden terrifying realization sparking in his pupils. I did not wait for his response. I bypassed my parents completely, walking right through the narrow gap between them with absolute authority. I strode purposefully toward the raised main stage at the far end of the ballroom, leaving my family standing frozen in the center of the whispering crowd. I stepped up onto the stage, ignoring the confused string quartet packing up their instruments. Behind the podium sat the venue's massive audiovisual control deck, currently projecting a looping slideshow of my parents' 40-year marriage onto two giant screens flanking the ballroom. I set my leather briefcase onto the podium and unclasped the metal locks with a sharp, resounding click. I extracted the heavily encrypted titanium flash drive from the interior pocket. I reached down, bypassed the venue's standard input feeds, and plugged the drive directly into the master projector control system. The romantic montage of my parents faded instantly, replaced by the stark, high-contrast interface of my data analytics dashboard. The twin massive screens flanking the ballroom glowed with complex financial flowcharts, bank routing numbers, and offshore corporate registry filings. I stepped up to the podium and pulled the microphone close. The sharp, high-pitched feedback echoed through the cavernous room, immediately silencing any remaining whispers. I looked out over the sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. My gaze locked directly onto the chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital, who was standing just feet away from my frozen, terrified brother. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady and amplified perfectly by the venue sound system. "For those who do not know me, my name is Paige Gallagher. I am a director of healthcare data analytics. My sister-in-law recently informed the internet that I am suffering from severe delusions. So tonight, I brought undeniable data to ensure we operate entirely in reality." I tapped the spacebar on my laptop. The screens behind me zoomed in on a specific Vanguard Capital portfolio ledger side by side with a Delaware shell company registration. "Trent Gallagher is a vice president at Vanguard." I continued pacing my words for maximum clarity. For the past 18 months, he has been executing a highly sophisticated embezzlement operation. He identified elderly, inactive clients within the firm and systematically drained their principal investments. He funneled exactly $4.5 million through a shell entity named Aegis Holdings, eventually routing the capital into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and angry shouts. Several Vanguard executives aggressively turned toward Trent, their faces flushing with pure corporate outrage. Trent held his hands up, stumbling backward, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. The evidence glowing above him was indisputable. The specific routing numbers, the transfer dates, and the exact dollar amounts matched his client portfolios perfectly. The Vanguard CEO pushed his way through the crowd, pointing a shaking finger directly at Trent's chest, demanding immediate answers that my brother was entirely incapable of providing. Club security guards started moving inward from the perimeter, sensing the rapidly escalating hostility. I tapped the keyboard again. The screens shifted to the corporate audit calendar. Your firm scheduled a mandatory third-party audit for this coming Monday, I announced, projecting my voice over the rising panic in the room. Trent realized the missing $4.5 million would trigger immediate federal wire fraud charges. He needed a massive untraceable bridge loan to replace the stolen capital before the auditors arrived. To secure that loan, he needed my half of our late grandmother's estate. When I refused to sign the deed over to him during a blizzard in Aspen, he stole my vehicle keys, stepped over my body while I was suffering a severe asthma attack, and left me to freeze to death so he could inherit my assets. My parents stood completely paralyzed in the center of the ballroom. Their desperate, meticulously planned conservatorship trap was now exposed as a frantic cover-up for attempted manslaughter and federal financial crimes. Richard gripped the edge of a cocktail table to steady himself, his face draining of all color. Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, staring up at the screens in absolute horror. But the embezzlement required a laundering mechanism, I said, shifting my focus to Jada. She was currently backing away from Trent, her eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for an exit. I hit the next slide. A waterfall of bank transfers flooded the screens, showing millions of dollars moving from the Cayman Islands directly into her primary business checking account. Jada laundered the stolen retirement funds through her influencer enterprise under the guise of fabricated consulting fees, I explained coldly. Every designer handbag, every luxury vacation, and every single sponsored post you watched her cry over was funded by the stolen life savings of Vanguard Capital investors. She willingly processed the stolen capital to maintain a lifestyle they could not afford. Jada threw her hands over her face, instantly shifting back into her professional victim persona. She let out a loud, theatrical sob, dropping to her knees on the marble floor. I had no idea she wailed, her voice carrying through the ballroom. Trent lied to me. He managed all our finances. I thought the money was from legitimate brand deals. I am a victim here too. Please, you have to believe me. I stared down at her from the stage. She was incredibly good at performing, but Data does not care about tears. I had anticipated this exact pivot. I did not expect you to take responsibility. Jada, I said, my voice dropping to a low lethal register. Which is why I pulled the decrypted direct messages from your private social media accounts. I pressed the enter key one final time. The massive screens illuminated with high-definition screenshots of Jada's private chat logs with a high-profile divorce attorney and her secret offshore financial planner. The timestamps were from just 2 days ago, right after she posted her viral video accusing me of addiction. I read the projected text aloud so nobody in the back of the room could miss a single syllable. Let Trent's parents push the medical conservatorship through on Monday, Jada had written. Once Trent gets control of Paige's tech company, shares have the Cayman accounts ready to receive the wire transfer. The second the money clears, file the divorce papers. I am not going down for his Vanguard mess. I am taking the cash and moving to Dubai before the feds raid his office. The entire ballroom inhaled a collective sharp breath. Jada's manufactured sobs stopped instantly. She remained on her knees on the polished marble floor, staring up at the massive screens in absolute naked terror. Her perfectly curated influencer facade, shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces, live in front of Seattle's most powerful elite. The undeniable proof of her betrayal hung above her, exposing her as a calculating, ruthless accomplice who fully planned to abandon her husband the second she secured my stolen wealth. The utter collapse of Jada's influencer persona sent a shockwave of disgust through the ballroom. The whispers from the crowd morphed into open hostility. Wealthy patrons who had previously fawned over Jada's aesthetic perfection now glared at her kneeling on the floor, recognizing her as an active participant in the systematic theft of their peers' retirement funds. But Richard and Brenda were not finished. Desperation is a powerful motivator, and they had spent their entire lives defending their golden child at any cost. Richard stepped away from his paralyzed wife, squaring his shoulders in a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. He pointed a trembling finger toward the stage. "Do not listen to a single word she is saying!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing loudly, trying to overpower the rising anger in the room. "My daughter is severely delusional and sick. She wandered into a blizzard in a complete state of psychosis. We filed an emergency medical conservatorship this afternoon because she is suffering from severe paranoia and hallucinating these ridiculous financial conspiracies." The Vanguard Capital CEO turned to Richard, his expression a mixture of profound skepticism and corporate fury. "Delusional. She just projected offshore routing numbers that perfectly match your son's client portfolios, Richard. Are you telling me she hallucinated a Delaware shell company? She hacked into his terminal." Brenda chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate as she moved to stand beside her husband. "She is a data analyst. She manipulated those numbers to frame him because she has always been jealous of Trent. Our psychiatrist confirmed she is completely disconnected from reality. We have the legal documents to prove it." I watched them scramble their lies, becoming more frantic and unhinged by the second. They were doubling down on the medical conservatorship, banking on the ingrained societal bias that a wealthy, respectable family would only take such drastic legal action out of genuine concern for a sick relative. They needed the crowd to believe I was crazy, because if I was sane, they were all going to federal prison. It was time to dismantle their final trap. I reached into the leather briefcase resting on the podium and pulled out a thick stack of heavy stock paper. It was not a spreadsheet or a routing number. It was a formal legal complaint, complete with the official seal of the State Medical Licensing Board. "You mean Dr. Silas Montgomery?" I asked, my voice calm and completely devoid of the hysteria they were trying to project onto me. "The high-priced psychiatrist you hired to rubber stamp your conservatorship petition without ever actually evaluating me," Richard sneered, trying to maintain his authoritative posture. "Dr. Montgomery is a highly respected professional. His evaluation stands." "No, it does not," I replied, raising the document for the entire ballroom to see. I tapped the spacebar on my laptop. The screens behind me shifted from financial data to a high-resolution scan of the medical fraud complaint. The names were clear and the charges were devastating. "Dr. Montgomery made a catastrophic error," I announced to the hushed crowd. "He referenced my emergency trauma admission in his affidavit. But he did not realize I was admitted under the direct care of Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief of trauma at Seattle General. Dr. Thorne does not tolerate medical fraud in her hospital." I looked directly at my parents. The color completely drained from their faces as they realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. Less than an hour ago, the hospital legal board filed massive federal charges against Dr. Montgomery. I continued, ensuring every word carried to the back of the room. "He actively falsified official hospital records and committed severe HIPAA violations to support your bogus diagnosis. He has already been suspended pending a full criminal investigation." The crowd gasped. The Vanguard executives exchanged dark, calculating looks. The narrative had definitively shifted. I was not the delusional addict. My family was a syndicate of white-collar criminals operating under the guise of high society. "And it gets worse for you," I added, lowering my voice to a lethal quiet register that somehow carried more weight than a shout. When the hospital legal team confronted Montgomery with the 4K security footage of Trent leaving me to die, the doctor immediately cracked. He fully confessed to the medical board. He admitted that you, Richard, and Brenda Gallagher paid him $50,000 to forge the psychiatric evaluation. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear the faint, rapid breathing of my panicked family members echoing through the microphone. "You did not just try to steal my independence," I said, staring into my father's horrified eyes. "You committed conspiracy to commit medical fraud. You bribed a licensed physician to lie to a federal judge. Your emergency conservatorship petition is completely dead." Richard staggered backward, bumping into a cocktail table. A glass shattered on the marble floor, the sharp sound snapping the tension in the room. Brenda let out a low, terrified whimper, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if it could protect her from the impending legal fallout. They were exposed. The pristine country club facade they had maintained for 40 years was entirely obliterated. They were no longer respected members of the elite. They were co-conspirators in a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement and fraud operation. Trent, who had been standing paralyzed near the stage, suddenly snapped out of his shock. He looked at the screens, looked at his parents, and realized the walls were rapidly closing in. His high-priced lawyers could not save him from federal routing numbers, and his parents' money could not buy a fraudulent diagnosis anymore. "You are lying!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You cannot prove any of this. It is all fabricated data. I am leaving." He turned and bolted toward the main mahogany doors of the ballroom, abandoning his parents, abandoning his kneeling wife, focused entirely on his own survival. He was going to run, but he did not make it past the entrance. Trent lunged for the heavy brass handles of the grand mahogany doors, his bespoke velvet tuxedo jacket pulling awkwardly across his shoulders as he moved with pure, unadulterated panic. The elite guests of the Crestview Country Club scattered rapidly out of his path, abandoning their champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. They no longer viewed him as a respected financial vice president or a beloved member of high society. They saw a dangerous cornered fugitive. He reached out his hands, desperate to shove the heavy doors open and escape into the cold Seattle night. He never even got to touch the polished brass. The massive doors burst inward with a violently explosive force, knocking Trent several feet backward. A highly coordinated flood of dark tactical windbreakers bearing bright yellow FBI lettering swarmed into the grand ballroom. These were not local patrol officers responding to a minor domestic dispute. This was a massive high-level federal raid, executed with absolute precision. Over a dozen armed agents fanned out across the marble floor, securing every exit and instantly seizing total control of the room. The lead special agent, a tall, imposing man with a severe expression, stepped over the threshold and raised an authoritative voice that completely eclipsed the venue's expensive sound system. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move." The Vanguard Capital executives immediately raised their hands and backed away, putting as much physical distance between themselves and Trent as possible. The firm's chief executive officer turned his back on my brother entirely, instantly calculating the massive public relations nightmare his company was about to face. Corporate loyalty vanished the exact second federal badges appeared. Trent stood frozen in the center of the room, completely surrounded by federal agents. His chest heaved as he looked wildly around the opulent ballroom, realizing every single avenue of escape was entirely blocked. The data packet I had sent to the federal authorities had mapped out his entire life, leaving him zero blind spots to hide within. In a final, utterly foolish act of desperation, he lowered his shoulder and tried to violently shove his way past the nearest agent to reach the lobby corridor. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The federal agent did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He grabbed Trent by the lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo, swept his leg, and slammed my brother face first onto the polished marble floor with a bone-rattling thud. Two more agents instantly descended on him, pinning his arms forcefully behind his back. Trent thrashed against the cold stone, his perfectly styled hair, now a messy, sweat-soaked disaster. He screamed that there had been a massive mistake, begging his parents to do something, pleading for them to call their expensive lawyers. Richard and Brenda just stood there, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the nightmare unfolding in front of their wealthy peers. The country club facade they had meticulously maintained for 4 decades was actively burning to the ground. They could not bribe a federal agent. They could not charm an FBI raid. They were entirely powerless, forced to watch the brutal consequences of enabling a criminal. The sharp, heavy click of federal handcuffs echoed loudly through the ballroom, ringing with a brilliant, undeniable finality. I stood at the podium, looking down from the stage. I watched the golden child of the Gallagher family get dragged to his feet, his designer suit ruined, his dignity completely stripped away. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and absolute terror. I did not flinch. I did not offer a sympathetic smile. I simply stared back with the cold, calculating precision of a data analyst who had successfully isolated and neutralized a toxic anomaly. While the entire ballroom was utterly fixated on Trent, weeping as his Miranda rights were read aloud, my analytical eyes scanned the perimeter of the room. Jada was no longer kneeling on the floor where her influencer empire had died just minutes prior. Utilizing the chaotic distraction of the raid, she had slowly army crawled behind a long row of draped cocktail tables, abandoning her husband entirely to save her own skin. I watched her stand up near the deep shadows of the catering entrance, clutching her designer handbag tightly to her chest. She began to slip quietly through the swinging service doors leading to the commercial kitchen. She actually thought she was smart. She genuinely believed her social media agility could outmaneuver the federal government. She thought she could slip out the back jump on a plane to Dubai and live happily ever after on my stolen inheritance and the drained retirement accounts of elderly investors. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing clearly over the commotion. "Agents, you might want to check the service exit," I announced. "The money launderer is making a run for it." Before the FBI agents could even reach the catering corridor, the heavy swinging doors forcefully pushed open. Jada stumbled backward into the bright light of the ballroom, her face a mask of absolute horror. Stepping through the doors right after her was a sharp-eyed woman in a crisp gray suit, holding a massive stack of thick legal documents. The gold badge clipped to the woman's belt did not say FBI. It said IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The federal agent stepped squarely into Jada's path, blocking any chance of retreat. "Jada Gallagher," the agent stated, her voice slicing through the remaining tension in the room like a scalpel. "You are officially being served with a federal subpoena for massive tax evasion, wire fraud, and international money laundering. We have already frozen your domestic and offshore accounts. Your passport is flagged and your assets are officially seized." The agent thrust the massive stack of papers directly into Jada's chest. Jada stared at the thick legal documents, the reality of her total financial annihilation finally setting in. She had no followers to save her. She had no offshore accounts to flee toward. The designer clothes she wore and the expensive bags she clutched were now property of the United States government. She looked over at Trent struggling in his handcuffs, then slowly raised her eyes to meet mine on the stage. The trap had closed perfectly. The heavy stack of federal subpoenas slipped from Jada's manicured hands, scattering across the polished marble floor of the catering corridor. She did not attempt to pick them up. The IRS agent simply clamped a firm hand onto her shoulder and guided her forward to join her husband. The federal agents marched Trent and Jada straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, parading them past the stunned faces of Seattle's highest society. The Vanguard Capital executives actively turned their backs as my brother was escorted away in handcuffs. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp, authoritative commands of the federal agents and the heavy thud of their boots. I calmly unplugged my encrypted titanium flash drive from the venue's projector system and slipped it back into my sleek leather briefcase. I closed my laptop, the screen going black, effectively ending the most devastating presentation of my entire data analytics career. I walked down the short flight of stairs from the stage, bypassing my completely paralyzed parents, without offering them a single glance. Richard and Brenda stood anchored to the floor, their faces pale and their breathing shallow. They had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of flawless upper-class superiority, and I had just burned it to the ground in less than 20 minutes. I walked out the main double doors of the ballroom, collected my tailored overcoat from the valet, and drove back to my secure hotel suite. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. By Monday morning, the local news had completely abandoned the narrative of my supposed mental breakdown. The digital dossier I handed the federal authorities provided such irrefutable evidence that the financial media networks picked up the story immediately. Trent's face was plastered across every major news channel, accompanied by staggering graphics detailing his $4.5 million embezzlement scheme. The Vanguard Capital Board of Directors issued a ruthless public statement, completely severing all ties with him, claiming they were fully cooperating with the FBI to audit every single account he had ever touched. Jada's digital empire disintegrated at a speed that defied modern social media metrics. The moment the tax evasion and money laundering charges went public, her massive online community turned violently against her. The followers she had weaponized against me just a few days prior now flooded her comment sections with absolute vitriol. Major luxury brands and cosmetic sponsors terminated their lucrative contracts with her within hours, citing severe breaches of their corporate morality clauses. Several companies immediately filed massive civil lawsuits demanding the return of promotional advances. Facing complete financial annihilation and a tidal wave of litigation, Jada attempted to file for rapid bankruptcy to shield her remaining assets. It was a desperate, foolish maneuver. You cannot declare bankruptcy to protect funds acquired through federal wire fraud. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division moved with ruthless efficiency, seizing her penthouse, freezing her domestic bank accounts, and confiscating every designer bag, watch, and vehicle she had purchased with stolen retirement funds. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes she wore to the federal courthouse. Trent's legal reality was significantly worse. On Tuesday afternoon, I watched his federal bail hearing through a secure digital feed provided by Detective Russo. Trent sat at the defense table wearing a standard-issue brightly colored jail uniform, a stark contrast to his usual bespoke tailoring. His high-priced defense attorney argued passionately for his release, citing his ties to the community and his lack of a prior criminal record. The federal prosecutor simply stood up and projected the exact same direct messages I had displayed at the country club gala. The messages explicitly outlined Jada's plan to wire the stolen funds to the Cayman Islands and flee to Dubai the second the money cleared. The prosecutor argued that Trent had access to offshore routing networks and clearly possessed the capital required to flee international jurisdictions. The federal judge did not even hesitate. She struck her gavel with a resounding crack, deeming my brother an extreme flight risk. Bail was emphatically denied. Trent was remanded directly back to federal custody to await trial, his face buried in his trembling hands. While Trent and Jada faced the federal justice system, the shockwave of their crimes slammed violently into Richard and Brenda. My parents had spent years blindly enabling Trent, financing his failures and funding his arrogant lifestyle to protect the family image. But their blind loyalty contained a massive fatal flaw. 2 years ago, when Trent first started experiencing severe liquidity issues before he resorted to outright embezzlement, he had begged them for a massive infusion of capital to keep his facade intact. Richard, desperate to keep his golden child successful, had co-signed multiple high-yield business loans for Trent's fraudulent shell companies. He had leveraged his own substantial investment portfolios and the equity of their sprawling primary estate to guarantee the debt. When the FBI and the IRS traced the tangled web of offshore accounts, they followed the financial threads right back to my father's signature. The federal government does not differentiate between a mastermind and a financial guarantor in a massive fraud syndicate. The authorities immediately flagged Richard and Brenda's accounts as heavily entangled with the stolen Vanguard assets. The court issued an emergency injunction to prevent the destruction of evidence or the hiding of capital. On Wednesday afternoon, completely oblivious to the impending financial doom, Richard and Brenda attempted to seek refuge in the one place they believed still commanded respect. They drove their luxury sedan to the Crestview Country Club, hoping to dine in the private lounge and spin a narrative of victimization to their wealthy peers. They walked into the elegant dining room, heads held high, desperately pretending the gala raid was a massive misunderstanding that their lawyers would soon resolve. They ordered an extravagant lunch, sipping expensive wine, and ignoring the harsh, judgmental stares of the other patrons. When the bill arrived, Richard confidently pulled his heavy black premium credit card from his wallet and placed it on the silver tray. The waiter bowed slightly and walked away to process the payment. 5 minutes later, the club manager approached their table. He did not carry a receipt. He carried an expression of cold, polite disdain. He placed the black credit card down on the white tablecloth. The manager leaned down and informed them that the card had declined. Richard, flushing red with sudden anger, pulled out 2 alternative premium cards, insisting there was a banking error. The manager ran them both. They declined instantly. The federal asset freeze had taken absolute crippling effect. Every single dollar they owned was locked down by the United States government. The manager looked at my parents, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet, listening dining room, and firmly asked them to leave the premises immediately. The utter humiliation of being escorted out of the Crestview Country Club, past the sneering faces of their former friends, was only the beginning of their rapid descent into absolute ruin. 3 weeks passed. My own professional trajectory took the exact opposite route. David, the chief executive officer of my firm, had thoroughly reviewed the undeniable, mathematically flawless dossier I used to expose Trent's federal wire fraud. He did not just lift my unpaid administrative leave. He fired the executives who had doubted my integrity and immediately promoted me to chief compliance officer. I now occupied a massive corner office on the 40th floor of our downtown Seattle high-rise encased in floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass. My desk was a sleek slab of polished slate overlooking the Puget Sound. I had rebuilt my fortress, and this time the walls were completely impenetrable. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly data audit when my sleek desk phone chimed. My executive assistant spoke through the intercom, her voice tinged with deep uncertainty. She informed me that my parents were standing in the main reception lobby. They had slipped past the ground floor security desk by aggressively tailgating a group of delivery workers. They were currently demanding to speak with me, claiming it was a severe family emergency. A month ago, my heart would have raced with anxiety at the mere mention of their presence. Today, my pulse remained absolutely steady. I checked my vitals on my smartwatch just to confirm. Perfect resting heart rate. I instructed my assistant to issue them temporary visitor badges and escort them directly up to my office. I wanted to see exactly what desperation looked like on the faces of the people who once thought they owned the world. When the heavy glass doors to my office swung open, I barely recognized the two people stepping over the threshold. The immaculate country club polish was completely gone. Richard was wearing a suit that looked 2 sizes too big, a clear indicator of the rapid weight he had lost from the sheer stress of the federal investigation. His usually perfect silver hair was unkempt and thinning. Brenda looked entirely hollowed out. She carried a generic tote bag instead of her usual designer purse, and the deep, dark circles under her eyes could not be hidden by her rushed, uneven makeup. They looked like terrified, drowning animals. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them a seat. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, folded my hands on the polished slate desk, and waited for them to speak. Richard cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably under my cold, analytical gaze. Paige. He began, his voice lacking every single ounce of its former booming authority. We know we have no right to be here. We know you are angry, but we had nowhere else to go. Brenda stepped forward, clutching her cheap tote bag against her chest like a life preserver. The federal government seized everything, she whimpered, her voice cracking with genuine unfiltered panic. They froze our retirement accounts. They locked our checking accounts. We cannot even buy groceries without the transaction being flagged by the Internal Revenue Service. And the bank just issued a formal notice of foreclosure on the house. I stared at her, maintaining absolute silence. The data was calculating perfectly in my head. They had co-signed Trent's fraudulent loans, wrapping their entire net worth around a criminal enterprise. The federal asset freeze was operating exactly as designed. We are going to be homeless by the end of the month, Richard pleaded, taking a desperate step closer to my desk. Trent is sitting in a federal holding cell. His lawyers drained whatever clean cash we had left before the asset freeze hit. We have absolutely nothing, Paige. We came to ask if you could issue us a personal loan, just enough to secure a small apartment and pay for basic legal counsel to untangle ourselves from your brother's mess. The sheer audacity of the request hung in the quiet, climate-controlled air of my office. They were asking the daughter they tried to lock in a psychiatric ward to fund their legal defense against the consequences of their own enabling behavior. Brenda let out a ragged sob, reaching a trembling hand toward the edge of my desk. Please, Paige. You are sitting in this massive corner office. You clearly have the resources. We are your family. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood out on the street to suffer. Family helps family in times of crisis. I slowly leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. The sheer hypocrisy of the word family coming from her mouth was the final satisfying piece of data I needed to close this chapter forever. "You want to talk about family crisis?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that caused both of them to visibly flinch. "Let us review the data, Mother. Just a few weeks ago, your golden child shoved me into a blizzard. He stole my car keys. He watched my airway close during a severe asthma attack. He stepped right over my freezing, dying body to save his own bank account." Richard swallowed hard, looking down at his scuffed shoes. "We did not know the whole truth then. We were trying to protect him." "You knew exactly what you were doing," I countered, instantly slicing through his pathetic excuse. "When the snowplow saved my life and ruined his murder attempt, you marched into my intensive care room. You did not ask if I could breathe. You demanded I drop the charges because my survival was embarrassing your reputation at the country club. You hired a fraudulent psychiatrist to declare me legally unfit. You tried to seize my assets and lock me in a psychiatric facility so your son could use my tech company shares to pay off his federal embezzlement debts." Brenda wiped a tear from her cheek, her face contorting with desperate grief. "We made a terrible mistake. We were blinded by panic. But you have won, Paige. You exposed everything. You have your career back. You have all this money. We are begging you for mercy." "Mercy is a variable that no longer exists in my algorithm regarding you two," I replied coldly. "You made a calculated statistical choice to sacrifice my life and my freedom to protect a criminal. Now you get to experience the exact same level of compassion you showed me while I was suffocating on that porch." Richard's face crumpled, realizing the absolute finality of my words. "Paige, please. We took the bus here because we cannot even afford gas. How are we supposed to get home? How are we supposed to survive the week?" I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life treating me as nothing more than a disposable asset. I reached out and calmly pressed the security button underneath my desk. "I am sorry, my finances are currently tied up," I said, my voice perfectly devoid of any emotion. "Why don't you try Uber?" The heavy glass doors behind them swung open immediately. Two large corporate security guards stepped into my office, their expressions stern and uncompromising. They moved efficiently, flanking my parents and instructing them to proceed to the service elevator. Richard and Brenda did not fight back. The last remaining shreds of their pride had been entirely stripped away. I watched through the soundproof glass as security escorted them out of my fortress, disappearing down the hallway into the absolute ruin they had built for themselves. The real estate attorney, a sharp man with a mind for numbers that rivaled my own, tapped the top of the crisp white page sitting on my polished slate desk. It was the closing paperwork for the Aspen cabin. 2 days had passed since I had my parents escorted out of my office, and this stack of documents represented the final physical tether to my toxic bloodline. The buyer was a massive commercial developer planning to bulldoze the rustic wooden structure to build a luxury ski lodge. I felt absolutely no sentimental attachment to the impending demolition. The cabin was not a repository of happy childhood memories. It was a crime scene. It was the frozen stage where my brother had calculated the value of my life and found it completely worthless. I picked up my expensive titanium pen. The weight of it felt incredibly satisfying in my hand. I flipped to the signature line of the property deed. This was the exact document Trent had shoved into my chest while the blizzard raged outside. He had demanded my signature through force, intimidation, and ultimately a brutal willingness to let me suffocate. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with smooth, unbroken strokes. The transaction was finalized with a notary stamp and a firm handshake. Within 4 hours, a massive wire transfer cleared my secondary banking portal. The millions from the sale instantly diversified into secure, high-yield municipal bonds and back-end server upgrades for my data analytics firm. I had successfully liquidated the past. The financial and legal severing from the Gallagher family estate was entirely complete. I owned nothing with them. I owed nothing to them. The wheels of federal justice grind much slower than real estate transactions, but their final destination is absolutely inevitable. 6 months after I signed away the Aspen cabin, the federal trial of my brother reached its definitive conclusion. I sat in the quiet safety of my newly purchased high-security Seattle townhouse. The rain tapped a gentle, soothing rhythm against the reinforced glass windows. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and used the smart remote to turn on the large flat-screen television mounted in my living room. I switched the feed to the local evening news broadcast. I did not watch out of anxiety. I watched because I appreciate seeing a dataset reach its logical verified endpoint. The news anchor appeared on screen, her expression suitably grave as the graphics behind her displayed Trent's mugshot next to the imposing seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A former Vanguard Capital vice president was sentenced today in federal court following a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, the anchor reported clearly. Trent Gallagher, 36, received a mandatory sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary. The sentence accounts for extensive wire fraud, international money laundering, and an additional conviction for reckless endangerment connected to an incident in Colorado earlier this year. The broadcast cut to raw footage outside the federal courthouse. The heavy glass doors pushed open, and Trent was led out by 2 armed United States Marshals. He was wearing a standard, shapeless khaki prison uniform. His hands were heavily shackled at his waist. He looked completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, bespoke-suited golden child who had mocked me at the country club gala. His face was gaunt, his posture was entirely defeated, and his eyes darted nervously at the flashing cameras before dropping to the concrete pavement. He looked like a man who finally realized his privilege could not purchase a pardon. The anchor continued her report detailing the secondary fallout. Federal prosecutors confirmed that Gallagher's wife, a former social media lifestyle influencer, accepted a binding plea agreement. By providing the Internal Revenue Service with full access to their offshore routing networks, she avoided federal prison time. However, she faces total asset forfeiture, catastrophic financial penalties, and a lifetime ban from holding corporate fiduciary roles. Jada had done exactly what her private direct messages predicted. The second the federal trap closed, she had viciously turned on her husband to save her own skin, trading his freedom for a reduced sentence. There is no loyalty among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among narcissists. The news segment concluded with a brief mention of the unindicted co-conspirators. While Richard and Brenda avoided formal criminal charges due to a lack of direct involvement in the wire fraud, the civil asset forfeitures had completely decimated their estate. They were currently residing in a low-income housing complex miles outside the city limits, entirely exiled from the wealthy society that had once defined their entire existence. They had not attempted to contact me since the day my security team escorted them out of my corporate office. The boundary I established was holding strong. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I analyzed my own internal metrics, searching for any lingering trace of familial grief, any spike of guilt, or even a rush of vengeful triumph. I found absolutely nothing. My emotional dashboard was completely neutral. Trent was going to a federal cell for 8 years. My parents were living in the poverty they had always deeply despised. Jada was a disgraced, bankrupt pariah. It was not a tragedy. It was simply the natural mathematical consequence of their own toxic variables. I picked up the remote and pressed the power button. The television screen instantly went black, cutting off the image of the federal courthouse and silencing the news anchor's voice. The quiet in my townhouse was not the heavy, oppressive silence of the Aspen cabin. It was the warm, secure silence of a life I had built entirely on my own terms. I set my wineglass on the coffee table and walked toward my spacious bedroom. I needed to get ready for the evening. I opened my custom closet, bypassing the sharp, armored business suits I usually wore for corporate warfare. Tonight required a different aesthetic. I pulled out a soft, elegant cashmere sweater and a pair of tailored trousers. I was not preparing for a battle. I was not heading to a toxic country club or a sterile hospital room. I checked my reflection in the mirror, noting that the scar on my temple had faded to a barely visible silver line. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that reached all the way to my eyes. I grabbed my keys from the entryway table. I had to finish setting up the dining room. I was getting ready for a dinner party I actually wanted to attend. The heavy oak dining table was already set with immaculate precision. I had arranged the settings using the exact same meticulous attention to detail that I applied to my corporate data models. Crisp linen napkins, polished silver, and tall crystal wine glasses gleamed under the warm amber glow of the modern chandelier. The rich, savory aroma of roasted turkey sage stuffing and caramelized root vegetables drifted from the chef's kitchen, filling my secure Seattle townhouse with an overwhelming sense of absolute warmth. Tonight was Thanksgiving. For the first 32 years of my life, this holiday had been a grueling, highly choreographed performance. It had meant sitting at a sterile country club table wearing an uncomfortable dress and silently enduring my mother's passive-aggressive critiques while my father loudly boasted about Trent's fraudulent financial victories. It had been an annual exercise in emotional survival. Today, however, the guest list was entirely under my control. The biometric security chime echoed softly through the hallway, signaling an arrival at the front gate. I checked the high-definition monitor on the wall. Detective Russo stood on the porch, wearing a thick wool coat and holding a premium bottle of aged bourbon. I tapped the glass screen to unlock the door. Russo stepped into the foyer, bringing a gust of crisp autumn air with him. He handed me the bourbon with a respectful nod. He was off-duty, trading his usual rumpled gray detective suit for a comfortable dark sweater. We did not need to discuss court dates, federal subpoenas, or attempted manslaughter charges tonight. That case was closed. The files were sealed. He was simply here as a trusted ally. Less than 10 minutes later, the security chime sounded again. Dr. Eris Thorne walked through the door looking striking in a tailored burgundy dress that was a dramatic departure from her pristine white hospital coat. She carried a massive, beautifully decorated artisan pie from a high-end local bakery. When she greeted me, her sharp, intelligent eyes quickly scanned my face and posture, a residual habit from our days in the intensive care unit. Finding no signs of hypoxia, trauma, or distress, her clinical gaze softened into a genuine, relaxed smile. My chief executive officer, David, arrived shortly after with his husband. They brought a rare vintage wine to celebrate my recent promotion to Chief Compliance Officer. My core data analytics team filled out the rest of the guest list. These were the brilliant, fiercely loyal colleagues who had seamlessly covered my corporate duties while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, and who had actively helped me secure the firm's data architecture against my family's hostile legal maneuvers. We gathered around the massive dining table. There was no assigned seating based on social hierarchy. There was no desperate competition for approval. The conversations that flowed across the table were vibrant, engaging, and entirely authentic. We debated predictive healthcare algorithms, discussed the latest developments in Seattle's tech sector, and shared stories that generated loud, unrestrained laughter. Nobody was tearing anyone else down to inflate their own ego. Nobody was secretly plotting a financial takeover. I sat at the head of the table taking a slow sip of the expensive red wine David had poured. I allowed my analytical mind to process the scene unfolding in front of me. I looked at Dr. Thorne, the woman who had stood between me and a fraudulent psychiatric hold, using her immense medical authority to shield my vulnerability. I looked at Detective Russo, the man who had treated my survival not as an inconvenience, but as a crusade for absolute justice. I looked at David and my team, the professionals who valued my intellect and integrity above all else. This was my family. The data was irrefutable. Biology is nothing more than a genetic lottery, a random assignment of shared DNA that guarantees absolutely nothing about loyalty, compassion, or safety. True family is a conscious, active choice. It is a network built on verified trust, mutual respect, and undeniable proof of character. These were the people who showed up when the system collapsed. These were the people who believed my data when my own blood relatives tried to bury me alive. A sudden sharp drop in the ambient temperature outside caught my attention. I turned my head to look through the expansive floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows lining the back of the dining room. The Seattle rain had slowly transitioned. Thick, heavy flakes of white snow were beginning to fall from the dark night sky, swirling gently in the glow of the backyard security lights. A year ago, snow had been the ultimate enemy. It was the freezing, suffocating weapon my brother had relied upon to execute his financial bailout. It had been the silent, blinding curtain that nearly extinguished my life on a dark, isolated porch in the mountains. For months after my physical recovery, the mere sight of frost on a windshield had triggered a spike in my heart rate. But as I watched the snow accumulate on the lush evergreen trees in my secure private garden, my lungs did not tighten. My airway remained perfectly clear. My resting heart rate stayed absolutely calm. I was safe. I was incredibly successful. And I was surrounded by a fortress of genuine love. The conversation around the table naturally quieted as the guests noticed my gaze directed toward the window. Dr. Thorne looked at the falling snow, then looked back at me, a profound understanding passing between us. She raised her wine glass slightly, a silent gesture of profound respect for the battle we had won together. I stood up from my chair. The movement was smooth and painless. My ribs fully healed, my strength entirely restored. I picked up my crystal wine glass and held it out toward the center of the table. To the systems that hold strong when tested, I said, my voice clear, steady, and resonating with absolute peace. And to the people who build them. The guests raised their glasses in unison, the clear, sharp ringing of crystal echoing through the warm townhouse. I took a final sip of the rich red wine. I turned my head to look back out the window. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a pristine, brilliant white. It was no longer a symbol of death, isolation, or betrayal. It was simply a beautiful, quiet reminder that the storm had completely passed, leaving behind the perfect foundation for my absolute rebirth. The profound lesson from this story is that true family is defined by actions, not merely biology. When those expected to protect you consistently choose their own comfort, wealth, or image over your well-being, walking away isn't an act of cruelty. It is necessary self-preservation. Sharing DNA does not entitle anyone to your peace of mind. Real family is built on mutual respect, unwavering sacrifice, and consistently showing up when it truly matters most. You have every right to protect your boundaries and walk away from conditional love. Share your own experiences with setting healthy boundaries and comment below